Code Fun Podcast Network.
This podcast is brought to you by our friends at Linode. Whether you're working on a personal project or managing your enterprise's infrastructure, Linode has the pricing, support, and scale you need to take your project to the next level. Get started on Linode today by going to linode.com/remote-ruby.
This is Remote Ruby.
Have you any remote idea to the meaning of the word?
Hey.
Hey.
What's up?
What's up? It's just us this week.
It's old school.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's been an interesting week. I mean, we're selling our house, buying land to build a new one. What a crazy week. But then, on top of all that, we got to secure our Hey email addresses, which is, a big deal. So yeah, that really makes me excited for Rails 6.1. I'm hoping that I would assume that all this stuff is going to be extracted for Rails 6.1, don't you?
I don't know. They were talking like the Rails 6.1 push is very soon. I don't know how fast they'll get the other stuff out with it, but I would sure to see it.
Yeah, and it may be more minimal stuff. Like they can release the new Stimulus separate from the Rails release and whatever, but I feel like the TurboLinks changes would affect scaffolds and those things, or just maybe it's just the TurboLinks Rails gem is the only thing that's really affected, So possibly it will be less changes, but I know they said there was the internals of Action text, and I'm sure Action mailbox has improved a lot too. So yeah, Hey has been just really elegant to use. I like all the keyboard shortcuts and stuff. I was poking around. It looks like they were using the GitHub hotkeys JavaScript library for that. Probably works on the mutation observers or whatever. That's a lot of fun. That stuff is really cool.
Yeah, I like using it. I said it. Well, so I got my invite, I guess Monday when invites were going out, and I forwarded I didn't even do that. I just let it sit for a day because I was like, I don't really want to go through all the work of forwarding email and figuring this out. So Tuesday morning I did that, and I feel ridiculous because I pay for Fastmail to use a custom domain, and all it's doing is archiving emails and forwarding them to Hey, which I will also probably be paying for. And so I'm excited for custom domain support, but everything else has been pretty cool. I said in work the other day, I think the thing I noticed the most about using it by Wednesday was I really don't care about the majority of the emails I get.
Yeah.
Now that they are starting to kind of on their own go to the feed and the paper trail, I check my inbox, I have nothing new, so I'm not distracted. Where before, even though I didn't really, at 4:00 every day when the Daily Memphian emails me all the news stories from the day, I do want to read that. I don't want to read it right then, but I'm already distracted because I saw it. I've already lost focus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so your brain went down that route already. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't forwarded my Gmail over yet because the way my email is GoRails and any of my other addresses go into, they all get forwarded to my Gmail account, and then I have it set up to auto reply from, if you email Chris at GoRails, it'll reply from Chris at GoRails. And so I should, maybe I'll keep that and just have the regular Exit 3 stuff go, forward over, and because that the clips and those other, features like the feed are really, really slick. And there are things that you would be forced into writing labels and things in Gmail, but it's not that organized. And I really love the okay, you got an email. Don't worry about it. We'll just keep it. You don't have to archive it. You don't have to organize it after you've read it. You're done. You go back to the inbox and, look at the next one if you want. You don't have to. And it's funny because the tab in Chrome, and I'm like, how many unread emails do I have? I don't know. Where can I find this info? Oh yeah, it's not supposed to be there. I'm not supposed to look for this stuff. And it is a very calming feeling to use. It's awesome.
Yeah, I like it. I keep I don't forward my work email there, and maybe I should. But so now I keep the mail app and Hey open, which is kind of counterintuitive, but I get way less email at work because I don't send anything to my work email address. So
yeah, and what is it? A lot of GitHub comment notifications or anything like that, or
yeah, and I even keep that turned off.
Yeah.
I'm like the worst coworker. I just get real overwhelmed really quickly when I have a lot of like notifications in GitHub that aren't related to me.
Mm-hmm.
I just turn the majority of them off.
Speaking of that, Slack did something weird on my phone the other day, and it said that I had 2 unread mentions or something. And my phone says that I have 1,002 unread. And I'm like, oh God, who messaged me? And there's definitely something broken with this, because when I log in or look at my computer, it's just a handful, not 1,000.
That's terrifying. That's like, hey, GoRails and Hatchbox all went down and charged me money for 7 years worth in one payment kind of worry.
Yeah, I saw that and I was like, oh my God, what happened? And nothing, apparently. So yeah, it is really nice. And I feel like, every piece of the app is also very simple, and it almost feels too simple. Like, I just sent you an email and it's like, there's nothing I have to do. I write you an email and it's done. And then that's it. It's very good with the, TurboLink 6 stuff where you write the email, you get some animations, compose your new email and whatever. But yeah, it feels very single page appy in a way, but we know it's not.
Right.
Cool.
And not only is it not, they are like touting how little JavaScript they wrote.
Yeah. Yeah. 40 kilobytes or something, he said.
It's crazy.
Yeah. Which is, it was funny. Andrew's not on with us this week, but he was, I don't think I talked about this yet, but he was poking around at the Tailwind Stimulus Components library that I made. And I had copied, I think, Adrian Pauly's Stimulus Flat Picker package JSON to build with Webpack to release the library on NPM. And he was like, yeah, do you realize that when you're publishing to NPM, the package is the entire Git repo? And it's like 200 kilobytes, and your code is 5 small stimulus controllers. And I was like, no. And yeah, there's, the build step builds as development mode instead of production mode. So it compiles all that stuff and then sends it up to NPM. And I was like, oh, that's good to know. So one change of that, and it went down to 40 kilobytes. And I think it's still 10 times bigger than it probably needs to be. So yeah, he was telling me it looks like there's something called Snowpack, which I don't really know what it is yet, but it's maybe a replacement for Webpack or a more modern Webpack or something. So I got to do some work and learn that, but it looks like I can probably go and grab Adrian's latest package JSON and not have to, learn it too much myself and just rely on his expertise there. But yeah, I was like, boy, that is way larger than it is. And it's not going to deploy that big because it's just going to compile it when Rails compiles it. But yeah, pretty funny.
I've been working on field help, and I've been toying with putting Tailwind UI in because I wrote all of it with Tailwind. So, but for some reason, I don't know if this is normal, but when I bring in the Tailwind UI package locally, my output's 10 to 15 meg for the JavaScript. And I know it's not running Purge or anything like that, but it's still it seems like I'm doing something wrong. I don't know.
Yeah, it seems high. There may be, the thing is funny with the color palette because it's generating font colors, border colors, background colors, every color you add is exponentially making this larger. So I know they have kind of maybe it's about the same, but they did expand the color palette or at least work on that with Tailwind UI. And I should look and see what it is for GoRails because I used Tailwind UI for the redesign of that. And I don't think it was anywhere near that big in development. It seems really large.
See, yeah, I did another app and I don't remember it having that problem. I don't know. It could be a myriad of other things. I've also got my editor I use. It's one I replace action text with. I had to bring it in through vendor. So it's possible I screwed something up there when telling Webpack to load from vendor too. But Yeah, it's just odd. When I don't run it, when I don't bring in UI, I mean, it's so large, but it's only like 2 or 3 meg in development. So,
Yeah, that sounds more reasonable. I know it's pretty big when it, has not been purged. And I will probably go, and it's not required, but now that Tailwind CSS has the PurgeCSS configuration thing, it's nice to just be able to use that and rely on their regexes and stuff. But I have yet to confirm, that's running PurgeCSS, but then it's going to apply PurgeCSS to all of your style sheets, I would guess. So if you included some custom CSS, or something, I would assume it would still, purge those. So maybe I can just straight up drop my PurgeCSS config that I added manually and use theirs, but I haven't been able to quite wrap my head around that.
I was reading about that this morning because I'm using PurgeCSS and I have a lot of config around, please don't purge all my styles from my editor.
Yeah.
It looks to be a JavaScript. Please don't kill it and stuff like that. And I was reading that with Tailwind, you can still pass those options in. Like it just is like the Tailwind configs are wrapper around the PurgeCSS config.
Gotcha. So yeah, the refactoring then for Jumpstart Pro would probably be just to strip out what I've got and just replace that with the options for their plugin, I think, which would be great.
Do you know what kind of action text changes are coming?
No, I don't. I believe it was kind of around the, complexities of the sign global ID stuff for attachments. It seems like that is probably the hardest part around it. So my guess is that it's related to that. But yeah, I think somebody on GitHub that works at Basecamp mentioned it offhand in a comment, and there's no more details as far as I know. So we'll have to wait on that one.
Yeah, it's a fun time to do Rails again. It felt for a while it was kind of boring, and it's a thing we talked about a lot. And it's not necessarily what I would have guessed would be the things that made Rails fun, but like I don't know. After working with Stimulus Reflex so much, I'm excited to see like Basecamp's kind of approach to stuff too. Like who would have thought that like just saying, hey, we allowed TurboLinks to support forms. That little sentence comes with so much complexity, I know, but it also brings like so much joy. Like,
yeah.
Such a pain point.
Yeah. And it also really very clearly explains action text and action mailbox. Those are the two core features that are Hay's interface,
Totally. Yeah.
So that's pretty funny. But yeah, it is cool. And this is like one of the interesting things that Jason Fried talked about on a podcast a long time ago, where he was like, it's really great to be able to focus on one product for so long because you like really, really get to understand it. But like you always need a different project to give you perspective on, something new. You need something completely different, and you'll be able to take ideas from that and add it to your long running project like Basecamp. And so, supposedly they're working on Basecamp 4 at the same time. So they've been busy. It's been, secretive, but they've been doing a lot of stuff.
I was thinking about that this morning, actually, how they launched Hey. I saw somewhere, I think David or Jason talk about they're working on a new version of Basecamp, and they didn't ramp up in hiring either. I don't think I saw them really hire any new devs in the last couple of years, like maybe 1 or 2 roles, but it's pretty crazy how they took a team that only worked on Basecamp, somehow siphoned part of it to work on Hey, while also building a new version of Basecamp. Like it's pretty impressive.
It really is. Yeah, like they've got the support team doesn't need to work too much on the new products. I'm sure they do and, are really helpful for that. But like their main job's probably still support Basecamp 3. But their cool thing about, and it goes against everybody's wisdom of don't rewrite your apps, like iterate and, change them. They always do a whole new version of Basecamp or whatever every 4, 5, 6 years. And Jason Fried related that to like, look, every new generation of Porsche was started from the ground up, not a bolt reused. And it's still a Porsche at the end of the day, but they can like rethink every single detail. And he was like, we want that. Like, we like doing that. And that to me was really refreshing because there is very little of that mindset in software these days. So that is a thing and a plan that I have for Hatchbox, actually. Like, I want to rewrite it knowing everything I know now, because the first version was like designed for a single user deploying an app to a single server. And now it's teams and clusters and all kinds of stuff that like are bolted on and are not the most, they're not as anywhere near as well designed as I would like them to be, but I wouldn't have been able to do it from scratch because it's too complicated. But now I know all those ins and outs. And if I start from scratch, I'll be able to build a really like strong, robust version of it. And I think that'll be really helpful. But you can feel it in Hey. They almost choose to ignore common wisdom and like what people are talking about just to think about things from first principles. And feels good to be in Rails right now because you're seeing those things come back out, with the new tech that's going to be released. And I like that. That's what I'm here for. The like, how do we reinvent things from first principles? And that's seems rare,
Yeah, no, it's exciting. So I mentioned I've been working on field help. And when I did that, I tried to stay as in the Rails ecosystem as possible, with the exception of asset pipeline. I just moved all my assets. When I ran it, I was like skip sprockets. Like I just want to do everything through Webpack. But as part of that, I did all my testing in just MiniTest. And the majority of my professional career, my full professional career has been in RSpec, and the majority of my side projects are in RSpec. But I thought that maybe we could talk about some of the things I keep bumping my head on or things like that. Like I mentioned this before the show, like I'm really used to the goodies, the little grab bag in RSpec of stuff I can just do no matter how big of a mess I make. Like at least, I don't know, conceptually it fits. And so when I get to MiniTest, I don't know, I feel kind of stuck sometimes. So yeah, I don't know, because correct me if I'm wrong, you're mostly a mini tester.
Yeah, pretty much 100%. It's the same kind of feeling I think a lot of people have when they do more Rails than Ruby. You are familiar with the DSL, and then when it's stripped away from you, and MiniTest strips it away from you, because you basically are left with, look, really, the only thing you really need for tests is an assert. That's about it. And they kind of take that philosophy. There's helpers, obviously, but it is you feel like you are just alone in the wilderness sometimes. And like you can search and search and search, and all you're ever going to get on Stack Overflow is RSpec examples that you got to figure out how to convert, and that is, or I've spent more time just diving in directly into, the MiniTest API docs and stuff to kind of wrap my head around it or whatever. I don't know if you know either where the line is between active support test case and like MiniTest,
I've tried, because when I wrote that Stimulus Reflex Testing gem, I tried to really understand active support test case. And I know maybe 5% more than I did when I started.
Interesting. Yeah, because I didn't actually ever, I knew they're like very similar, but I didn't know if it was active support test case was like a wrapper around MiniTest or whatever. Because when you hear people talk about, using MiniTest in Rails, it's not like you're adding MiniTest. You just use active support test case. So I'm guessing it's maybe a little wrapper, but it may be a separate thing. I don't actually know. These are funny things. Like it feels bad confessing that, like a Rails developer for, 10 years now, maybe. And I haven't ever needed to dive into that, too much.
Well, I think that's why I've put off this conversation is like, I like pride myself on like, being a Rails developer. but I feel stupid when I use MiniTest. And so I thought, let's just rip off the Band-Aid and see what we can come up with.
Yeah, it's good. I don't know if I'll be helpful or not, but what are your kind of struggles with it?
So let's start kind of low-hanging fruit. So the first major thing you kind of conceptually run into is Rails by default gives you fixtures, right? And factories are not first party concept in Rails. And so you can use factory bot with MiniTests. You can use it with, I use it with RSpec almost religiously.
Yeah.
And so it makes me wonder, if Rails doesn't ship with factories, does that mean at Basecamp they only use fixtures for testing?
It's an interesting question. And I've blended that a bit as well. So these fixture YAML files are interpreted with ERB just like normal. Some of it needs to be hard-coded or at least referenceable between files if you're doing associations. But, you can say, when you load the fixtures, go create 1,000 random examples with faker data. So if you want to create 1,000 random users that you don't know their email addresses, you can do that. You have to give them a name. So user 1 or user 2, so on. But you can use an ERB loop to generate stuff that will be loaded in as fixtures that will kind of do what you need with the factory a lot. But it's all loaded into your database, so it's going to be fast, which is the tendency that a lot of factories end up making your test slow on accident because you don't know what's creating things in the database and when, and things get messy when you gotta add database cleaner and whatever. And it just kind of goes down a little rabbit hole of I don't know where tests are creating things. And so we're just going to, clean it all up with database cleaner. And it feels like using a big hammer to try and make it work. So that's one approach that I've done. I've tried to create fixtures that I reuse. So I'll have a guest user or for if I'm testing Go Rails, I'll have a user I can log in as that is not subscribed. I'll have one user that's subscribed with a credit card. I'll have one that's subscribed with PayPal, and I'll have one that's an admin user. And I'll try and keep my tests using those same fixtures every time. And then that keeps it a bit more consistent throughout the test suite. But there's some times where I need, maybe to test pagination or whatever on the forums, then I can go and use, a loop in my fixtures to generate, 100 different forum conversations or posts or whatever. And then, there's lots of situations where you need to control it, or maybe your test needs to specify exactly what is being created, And so those times I'll either write the factory type stuff directly in the test if it's not that complicated and generate random data in the test because I'm trying to create a situation and I like my test to control all of that in a single place so that it's the test knows how to create the simulated world that we're trying to test, so then I can see that all in one place because I may have a mistake in that or something. And then, there's other times where just, adding factories makes sense, but I try and avoid them. And that's my kind of take on probably what Basecamp does too, use factories, but know their limitations and then slowly add, not generated factories or fixtures, and then go to factories when you have to. That's kind of my understanding of what they might be doing.
So I've been trying to just do it with fixtures and not use factories. The reason I want to use factories is because, like you mentioned, those one-off cases where you need data in a certain state. I don't know, maybe I'm too much of a perfectionist, if you will, but I don't want to when I do that, manually create a record, right? Say just calling the model and saying .create with the attributes. Because what if I add a validation later and all those tests start breaking because, I didn't pass that attribute into that one test. And so like, that's why I do like the factory approach. Like for that is because like I just have one place I update it, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that it doesn't break other tests.
Yeah. You like the sort of like if the test creates the record, then it's a bit more self-contained. Is that
right? Yeah. And like using a factory means that like if I'm using factories throughout my app, right? Like if I add a validation to the model, like a presence validation that none of those have, I can just go to the factory and be like, oh, give it this. And like all those tests get it, right?
Yeah. And I guess my example of like user who is a guest, user who's a subscriber, and an admin user, those are like, consistent ones that you can have. And you'll see that stuff in the Rails repository for fixtures. They'll have like a folder of fixtures that is, you might have a fixture written in there that just one single test uses. And I think the way that they write it is like, if that fixture happens to be useful for another test, great. But if your other test needs changes and you want to preserve that for the original test that it was written for, you just copy it and make another fixture and put it in there.
That makes more sense.
You end up with a YAML file of fixtures that are as reused as possible, but you add specific examples that are kind of related to a certain test. And then you would try to name them descriptive of like, the user example is pretty obvious, but like, a guest user, admin user, and describe like what the intent of that fixture and what it's supposed to be used for testing. Because then you can go through and, like loop through all those users and make sure that for the premium content on your site, the guest user cannot, but the paid users can, and the admin can as well. And so like I might write a test that goes through those users and just, checks them all together. And it's like, well, I know that this page, so I might write instead of maybe 4 tests, I'll have like one test that's like, here's verify, like I'm trying to test the like before action to make sure that, only the correct users can be paid or if they're paid can view something. And you could do that as 4 tests, or you could do that as like 1. And, to me, if it's simple enough of a test, whatever. I'll have the assertions in the same one. I haven't adhered too much to the like 1 assertion per test as some people do. I don't really find that as critical. And it also just makes my test suite get giant pretty fast. And like I will have a specific test for something I want to be for sure about. But, if it's like, make sure that only the right users can access premium this page, then I don't mind if I have all those examples in the same test, unless they get more complicated for setup or whatever.
That fixture stuff actually, it's so simple, but I hadn't thought about like, I guess in my head, I always tried to like put these constraints so I can only have so many fixtures. But you're right, like just add more for the cases I need. And then I could see not needing factories at all, like if you went that route.
Yep. I haven't had a need for factories most of the time, but you do sometimes want to do the loop of like, this user should have 47 charges attached to them. But then it's almost like writing one fixture with random data on each one, and then you end up writing, because I think the tendency with factories, if you write them in the test or in a setup block, you're kind of reinventing that every single test. Whereas in your fixtures, you are encouraged to reuse them, so they're kind of always there and you can always reference them. The tricky part is when you need something very similar to that, but slightly different, you have to copy and add a new example to your fixtures.
That actually helps a lot. That's like the best of both worlds for me. Because I already use Faker. Faker is my favorite Ruby gem that has ever existed.
Yeah.
And will probably always be. So I usually like in my factories, like for name, I just drop in ERB and like faker name.name.
Yep. I love that. It's great. I will maybe do for admin user, users, their name or whatever. But for the rest of it is all faker. Faker is fantastic. And that even helps catch bugs sometimes where you're like, faker generated something that I wouldn't have put in the fixture myself. And that's a good way to catch stuff. Or it also helps you make sure you're not validating the hard-coded values in your fixtures, right?
Right.
Like you don't want to verify in your test that it's exactly the string when you honestly don't care. You care whatever the record's email address is or the user's name. You don't care what the fixture has because when someone changes it, your test should not break. But you do have a tendency to maybe do that on accident a bit more with fixtures than you would with factories.
So along those lines, I guess this actually, I kind of answered my own question while you were talking earlier. But I was thinking like one of the things about factories that has kind of felt weird to me coming from like what I'll deem as like the RSpec factory bot like combination, which is pretty common, I think, is that like using fixtures, I have to like have this knowledge of what the fixture's called, like in the fixture file, where like with factory bot, you just say, create the name of the factory. But now that I think about it, in factory bot, a lot of times I will actually like use traits. So like, if I need a record in a certain state, I'll be like, create this record with this state. And I guess that's really the same thing I'm doing with fixtures at that point is I'm just saying like users with this state, right? Like,
yeah, the examples are always bad that they generate like fixture 1, fixture 2.
Right.
And yeah, as soon as you can get away from that and write them as descriptive of like the name of your fixture should kind of describe the state in the fixture, like a refunded payment, a completed payment, a fraudulent payment, that sort of thing. Name your fixtures that, and then when you reference them in your test, it's just the same as your traits or your description of the factory from factory bot.
Yeah. Okay. That makes me feel a lot better about using fixtures and such for that. One thing I don't know if you ever do this kind of testing. I know people think it's worthless, but like Shoulda Matchers in RSpec that like should validate presence of this. I mean, they're available for MiniTest too, but I don't know if you ever use those. Like, do you ever test your like certain validations or associations, things like that?
Yeah, I test the validations. I test the validations like all the time. Yeah, that stuff is not great because your alternative is like you assign an invalid value, you call valid on the record, and then you go through record.errors and the attribute name, and then it gives you an array of errors, and you have to see if that array includes your message, and then your message has to be like a hard-coded, or you just check for errors on that field, period, which is what I tend to do most of the time. Because I will generate, so for example, maybe you have an account and it has a subdomain and you want to just verify that no customers are grabbing like help.myapp.com. I will either go as far as just saying, hey, we assign help as the subdomain, we validate and we check and make sure that the subdomain field has errors. Any errors, as long as it's not an empty array, we're good. That will bite you in the butt as soon as you have other validations on subdomain, because it might be the other validation that tripped or whatever. It's not specific enough. And you can then, go and make sure the string is in that array, and say like, help is not a valid subdomain or whatever your error message is. The problem with that is you end up having to write your error message hard-coded in your test, basically, which is the thing that's frustrating there. Because if you change that text, then your test fails. but it's related. So it's not too bad. And it almost never changes once you write it the first time. So I haven't felt too bad about writing hard-coded, matchers and just make sure this array includes the string for the validation. And that's kind of what I'll end up doing most of the time. And if I had to guess, that's probably how the Shoulda Matchers ended up implementing that for a lot of cases internally. Okay. But yeah, that's kind of how I've been tackling it.
I had wrote for field help. It was like back in November, so it's been a while since I've looked at it. But it was like I wrote a custom assertion for validation. It was like asserts. It was like assert present or something like that. Assert validates presence or something like that. But under the hood, that's all it did, right? Was it looked, hey, for presence, like, did I try and set this value? And it looked at the array. It didn't look for the message, but in errors, at least prior to Rails 6.1, you could like call errors and get a list of keys. And I just looked for the whatever is like can't be empty key.
Yeah, I think there's no other way of handling that other than using maybe it's one where it's like it's trivial enough. I don't think it hurts to add a gem that adds those matchers in, like it is, you're either going into errors and looking it up yourself. And if you want to do that, great. But it also is pretty simple to just have a helper method or whatever. And honestly, I will probably lean towards writing my own helper in active support test case in like the test helper file or a support file or something and just do it myself instead. But if I'm going to do a lot of them and a lot of like, testing multiple types of validations, then just grab a gem. It's going to save you time. I don't think that one's a bad one. And the thing that came to mind while we were talking was like one of the things I don't like about like MiniTest and active support test case and stuff is like I don't like nested context blocks in RSpec, but I really miss that. Maybe like I'll have a test file for testing my episodes controller on GoRails. And I have free videos and paid videos. And so I want a section in there where I'm testing against a paid user and a non-paid user. And I want to make sure that they can both see the free videos. So I can put that as like a test that applies to both or whatever. But you have to define a class. So you might have an episodes controller test class and then nested in that another class that's like regular user test that inherits from the episodes controller test class. And because the parent is inheriting from, active support test case, all of those tests will run from that class. So it's smart enough to look at those subclasses and you can create a context block that way, basically. And I think even you could probably define an initialize method to do any setup stuff. I believe that's how that works. So you don't have to have any DSL stuff. You can just use pure Ruby to write, your nested groupings. It's a little quite a lot, I would say, heavier handed because you're writing a class and it's got to inherit from, another class and whatever. But it is nice that you can still do that. But I think there's a context block like extension for MiniTest. And
there is, yeah.
I prefer that, honestly. It's too verbose to write your nested classes just to get a little bit of organization. And I don't want them in, most of the time, I don't want them in separate files,
right.
But you could, that's another way of slicing it too.
That's a good point. That was a thing I experienced because like with RSpec, if I'm testing a model, I'll say like describe class methods. And in that describe block is where I will write tests for all my different class methods. And then I'll have either another describe block for instance methods or just straight up at the root level. But like it feels weird in MiniTest because it's just a flat file, right? Where you're like testing both like scopes or class methods and instance methods. And it's, I could differentiate it with comments, but like, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's not a huge pain point, but it is annoying.
It gives me Vietnam flashbacks of like cucumber tests where your file with all the matchers is just like one thing after another, and there's no organization and you can't find anything. Yeah. Those are not my favorite parts of it. I think I feel like that could be done better, or like almost those little features are worth adding. I know they want to keep it as minimal as possible and as plain as regular Ruby as they can. And it works. It's just for clarity, I feel like it's a little more complicated to read as a, test writer. So
yeah. So the context, like you can bring in that like context block stuff as a MiniTest extension. Does it then switch to the it syntax, or is it still like test this thing?
I don't remember. And that's a little thing that I missed, the like, the test method I think is really nice to have instead of like define a method called test _ whatever. It's just a bit more verbose than you really care. And maybe these are the things that like active support test case adds to wrap around that a bit. But yeah, maybe that is because I write, the test, in a string for these with active support test case. But with MiniTest, I think you have to define a method called test _ whatever. So maybe that's some of the boundaries that they made it a little bit of a DSL for Rails testing to be a bit easier. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. There's like, you feel like you have to jump through some hoops to add stubs and mocks a little bit, I feel like, with that too.
That's my next biggest thing I want to talk about.
Yeah, and like the class expect to any instance to receive a method call as like really nice, but you really feel like you're just not able to do the same kind of thing in MiniTest sometimes, because you can do like this class stub this method and then give it a return value, and then like that's got to run in a block, and then the block when it's over will unstub that and clear it out. And so that is, you end up maybe having to nest that stuff, or it's harder to do that multiple times. Like if that method might be called 2 or 3 times, it gets a little trickier, it feels like, and it's really hard to find good examples of how to do it because they're always like, the RSpec version of it when you Google stuff. And that again, is one of those things where you're like, really, if you are maybe doing this, then your code could maybe be architected a little bit differently. So you could pass in things to make your test easier. And I'm not a big fan of like rewriting my code just to make testing easier, but it like does make your code a bit more modular. In the future, you may be, injecting some dependency that, you can use in actual code too, that your tests happen to help you architect better. So yeah, that one's, I have examples of that somewhere. Like I know the GitLab here for Jumpstart Pro has some stubs that we do to do some of that for like the config. Like Jumpstart Pro has like a config object with like Stripe is turned on and SendGrid and whatever. And I've written some of those tests to say like, hey, go stub this out and we'll pretend that Stripe is on. I don't really care if it's on or not. And then I can run all those tests there. But you can't really do that because it like is a block. You can't really do that in a setup block or something where you might want to do that every time for this whole test file. It's not as flexible, it seems, as RSpec there. So you do, I feel like, have to go a little bit around changing that and making your code work in the way it wants it to. So yeah.
You ever use Mocha?
Yeah, Mocha's great. And that one I see regularly added to, a MiniTest or active support test case project because I think it makes that easier.
So, like all these things are like, I don't know. It's not uncommon for me to like reach for a gem for stuff, right? Like, I don't think that's uncommon for any Ruby developer, but I always ask myself, if Rails didn't ship with this, how do they do it at Basecamp? That's like the question I always ask. Like, do they bring in MiniTest mock? Do they bring in Mocha? Like, or do they just use the default testing stack? And if so, how do they do that? So
yeah, that'd be. I think we would all love to see their gem file for Basecamp or Hey or whatever. That would be really cool. Yeah, a lot of that. I wonder if they seem to be a group that would just prefer to write it from scratch, build what they need, and not pull in a gem, but maybe use the gem as like inspiration on how theirs would work or whatever. Like you see, they don't want to deal with authentication or devise or any of that stuff, So that would be my hunch, is they're probably building little support files or something to do it themselves.
I think that's most of my questions. Like the assertion stuff, like I like, asserts difference, assert changes. Like I use that stuff in RSpec a lot. The expect subject to change. So like I like the MiniTest ideology. And like I like the simplicity of it, but it's some of that syntactic sugar in RSpec that I miss. So this was good though. This helped.
Yeah, I think I regularly find myself Googling things when I'm, using active support test case or MiniTest. And yeah, it's a thing where like I was telling you before we recorded, Julian Rubbish is building betterstimulus.com, which is kind of like taking better specs. That site was great for RSpec examples and like, here's a good example, here's a bad example. And applying that to stimulus controllers in JavaScript, because it's like a very flexible tool, but how do you build good stimulus controllers? You can make them composable and stuff, which is like interesting, but you don't know you can do that until you see a good example. And then you're like, ooh, here's like a ton of ideas I get out of this. So he's like putting that site together. And then as we were talking, I bought betterminitest.com and I haven't done anything with it yet, but I'd like to go through all of the better specs examples and show, MiniTest versions of them and then expand from there and show like, we can talk about the fixtures and the dynamic fixtures and then factories and, those equivalents of like, you don't necessarily have a context block here, but you can use a class, which is the equivalent. And, we can maybe create a good repository of all that because there are very few or hard to find examples, stuffed in Stack Overflow somewhere after you sift through 15 RSpec examples when you search for something. So,
yeah, I dig it.
It needs better documentation, I think, for sure. Yeah, well, we'll probably wrap it up there, huh?
Yeah, no, this was good. This was really good for me. That's 2 weeks in a row where I've selfishly gotten a lot out of the episode. So.
That's good. That's what we do this for, right? I have a lot of fun, like learning about your stimulus reflex experiences has been really good for me to wrap my head around that. And you've published the Stimulus Reflex Testing Library, haven't you?
Yeah. It's not perfect or anywhere near complete, but it exists. So
yeah, and that's an exciting one because we were talking about that recently where, that gem, you have written it in a way that you've got helpers that can be applied to RSpec and MiniTest, which I think is really cool. So like, building something that's compatible with any test suite is a pretty neat thing. And I want to see how you did that because I think I'll learn stuff from that.
Yeah, everything I learned, I stole from Action Cable Testing. I think that's just the name of the library.
Oh yeah, like Paulkin, I think wrote that. Yeah.
It was written before Rails had action cable like testing built in. And so like Rails 6 and RSpec 4 both shipped with this library, essentially, like the code from it. So
yeah, which is awesome. So yeah, I hope that gets rolled into Stimulus at some point. It'd be great.
Be cool. So all right. Well, I'll talk to you next week.
All right. See you, man.
This podcast is brought to you by our friends at Linode. With 11 data centers worldwide, including their newest data center in Sydney, Australia, enterprise-grade hardware, S3-compatible storage option, and their next-generation network, Linode delivers the performance you expect at a price that you don't. Get started on Linode today by going to linode.com/remote Ruby.